Welcome back, Richard. It's good to see you again this
All
morning.
right. Good to see you.
And today we are going to respond to another person who wrote in to the podcast. Actually, wrote to us in response to another one that someone had written into us. So last week we did a podcast. Our midweek podcast last week was about conduct disorder and homework, conduct disorder and ADHD, and homework in basically high schoolers with teenagers. And in that podcast we kind of talked about how the challenge is, that they're teenagers, and by that time, your focus really maybe needs to shift away from homework a little bit because of it's really difficult to get teenagers to force teenagers to do some of those kinds of things. You need to work on some other aspects, and so check out that last week's podcast if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that. But the person that wrote in asked basically, what about middle schoolers? What about that 11 to 13 or so age range? So they're not quite high school because and dealing with the issues that high schoolers are dealing with, but they're also not elementary school age kids, but this middle age. And so we thought we would try to tackle that today.
Right. In the last week when we talked about that older teenager, who was a high school student, but he had conduct disorder, and which is a pretty serious issue to deal with, and so we talked a lot about, this boy is going to be an adult in a year or two. He's going to be 18, and that diagnosis of conduct disorder has real serious psychological and legal implications.
Right.
And this listener asks a very good question. Well, what about a younger teenager who has oppositional defiant disorder?
Mhm.
And because, as many of you already know, some children, I think about 30% or so of children with oppositional defiant disorder will go on to develop conduct disorder. So this is sort of an earlier version of that. You don't think of a 4 or 5-year-old having conduct disorder. They're not robbing stores and doing drugs and being, but they are misbehaving in ways that we find challenging. And so this listener was asking, well, what about a younger teenager? Well, a younger teenager, middle schooler, brings two unique challenges. One is they're in middle school.
Yes.
I'm sorry, that's a life challenge. So the reason that middle schoolers present a unique challenge is because it's usually during middle school when puberty appears, when it arrives. All right. So we know that it arrives sometimes as early as 8 or 9 or 10, but typically puberty arrives around 11 or 12, a little bit later in boys than girls, but middle school is when puberty hits. Well, when puberty hits, the reason that's important is because the brain goes through a massive change where it grows all sorts of new things, and you get this tsunami, this flood of neurochemicals.
Right.
And the way the brain works, the way our DNA does this, is that the brain will produce more chemicals than it's eventually going to need.
Right.
So if you think of adolescence as from age 12 to age 20, at the beginning of adolescence, you're going to have more of everything. And through the course of adolescence, it will pare down to an adult brain by the time you get to your mid-20s.
Right.
So it's the early adolescent years where you have an overabundance of everything. And that's why middle schoolers present a unique challenge, because of what their brains are going through. All right.
Yeah.
By the end of elementary school, around age 11, most of our neurons and most of the connections between neurons are in place. So by the end of elementary school, children have become, by like 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, they've become self-sufficient. They participate in activities, and they don't worry too much about what other people think. They act silly and they dress up in funny costumes and they act goofy, but they're not terribly concerned about what others are thinking. And they're fun to be with. They can take care of their own toileting needs. They
Yeah.
know to wash their hands. They can feed themselves. So they just become more competent. They're more fun to be with, and they want to be around us. They'll join us in the kitchen, and they want to be around us. They want to get in bed, and they want to cook, and they want to come to the hardware store with us. This is a quiet period. This elementary school years, it's a quiet period. In fact, Freud being the first child psychologist, called this, he referred to it as the latency period, where not much is going. He was talking about not much sexual activity, but there's not much activity. It's a period of relative calm
Right.
that occurs before the storm of adolescence. Now, there's things happening in the brain, and mainly we're growing these pathways, but it's sort of a quiet time.
Yeah.
Teachers know all about this because most teachers want to teach fourth and fifth graders because they're competent and they can do things and they're fun to be with. Most teachers don't want to teach middle school because middle school is another host of challenges.
Yeah.
So with the arrival of puberty, the brain begins this years-long period of growth and change that will not slow until we get to our mid-20s.
Right. Yeah. And as you said a moment ago, the biggest strike, the biggest jolt of this is right at the beginning, because your body sort of hits you with all of these chemicals, oftentimes hormones and other neurotransmitters and neurochemicals. And it's creating new neurons, it's creating new connections, and all of this stuff is happening at the same time. And just so happens to be during this middle school time frame. And so once that begins, over the subsequent 10, 15 years or so, there are these really turbulent times, and then things will get a little bit calm, and then all of a sudden things will get up, kind of escalate again, and then they'll kind of calm. But that wave sort of diminishes over time because our brain gets more and more used to what it needs. As you said, it sort of overproduces at the beginning so that it can kind of cut back on what it doesn't need. It's the same thing that happens at birth. You're born with more brain cells. You're born with more neurons than you will eventually need. But
Right.
it's like your body's attempt to let's put as much out there as we can, and then we'll just cut back what we don't need. And it's the same thing that happens here in puberty.
Yeah, we want to make sure there's enough, so
Yeah.
we overproduce, and it happens at birth and it happens in teenage years, that we want to overproduce so that we make sure you have enough, and then you can cut back what you don't. We'll prune off. The brain will prune off what you're not using. We talked about that in another podcast. But those first few years where you get this huge jolt, the brain is most unstable during middle school, about age 12 to about age 14 or 15. Beginning at about age 15 or 16, the brain begins to stabilize, and the new connections are formed, and the amount of brain chemicals decrease over time, and the brain becomes more stable. But during this period that we call adolescence, our lovely little children, our little we call them our little cherubs in elementary school, turn into foul smelling, foul talking, and they become adversaries. All of a sudden, this child who wanted to go to the hardware store, who wanted to cook, who wanted to help out with things, suddenly they become adversaries who proclaim that you're the worst parents ever, and they just seem to turn against us.
Right.
So normal part of the process, but those are middle schoolers, okay?
Right.
So when approaching a middle schooler, remember that this is new territory for you and them, and you're going to meet resistance on many issues, whether it's homework or some other issues. And these battles that you have are not going to end well.
Right.
We had a bear sighting in our area last week. You heard about that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, we were told, if you encounter the bear, stay away from it. It's like this coffee is hot, so be careful that you don't
Yeah.
But so if you see this bear, so think of an adolescent, think of a middle schooler as a bear on your porch. Okay?
Yeah.
So be careful. All right.
Right.
It's going to get better. You know, the bear
Right.
will go away eventually. But think of it as having a bear on your porch or in your house. And that for now, be very, very careful with a middle schooler. Now,
Absolutely.
what this caller was asking about was what about ODD and ADHD in a middle schooler? How do you get them to do homework?
Right.
Okay, so let's talk now about what does ODD look like?
Right. Yeah, we've talked about ADHD in other podcasts, and so we know. Hopefully, most of you know what ADHD brings to the
Mhm.
table, but oppositional defiant disorder, it's it's sort of just from a diagnostic perspective or from a clinical perspective, it's sort of just below maybe conduct disorder. So you get a lot of angry and irritable behavior, very argumentative and defiant, somewhat vindictive, perhaps. So they'll argue, they'll resist, they'll refuse, they'll ignore, they'll have tantrums. A lot of times it looks very much toddler-like in some of those tendencies. During the terrible twos or so, you hear a lot of
Yeah,
no's. Well,
right.
those no's kind of go away during
Mhm.
during much of the elementary school years, but then they make this resurgence, a sudden return during middle school, where you start suddenly hearing the word no
Right.
a lot again.
Yeah, it's like the terrible twos or threes, you know, where you have this rebellion, and you get that again in the early teenage years. So ODD there are really three main characteristics that you mentioned. They're angry and irritable, they're argumentative, a little bit defiant, and they're vindictive. Okay. Well, didn't we just talk about middle schoolers?
Right.
That's exactly what middle schoolers look like. So we say, okay, well, what's the difference between a tantruming 3-year-old or a tantruming middle schooler compared to somebody with oppositional defiant disorder? How do we get to ODD?
Right.
Well, there's two issues with oppositional defiant disorder. One is the frequency of their behavior, and the other is the intensity.
Right.
And the Mayo Clinic has these wonderful things. If you ever wonder about anything, these Mayo Clinic things are very reliable. And they remind us that even the best behaved children will occasionally have these difficulties.
Mhm.
But to get to ODD, there's a frequency and a pattern and that occurs over time. So these are frequent and an ongoing pattern of anger and irritability and arguing and defiance. But it also includes this vindictiveness. And I think that's another issue that parents in particular and teachers need to be aware of, that most children are not going to be vindictive. So
Right.
when you see vindictive, revenge seeking, I'm going to get even with you. You've hurt me, now I'm going to hurt you. That's a little more concerning. So of these things, I would worry a little bit more about being vindictive.
Right. And I think that even when it comes to that, now, a lot of parents are going to say, well, he blames other people. He says, well, it wasn't his fault. Somebody else did it. That's not vindictiveness. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right.
But also,
Mhm.
you know, if something happens and your adolescent or your middle schooler says that, oh, I'm going to get him back for that. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and if it happens in those isolated circumstances, again, that's not really what we're talking about. When we're talking about the
Right.
frequency related to ODD, we're talking about something that happens frequent. We're talking about something, in really young kids, we're talking about something that happens most days, almost every day.
Right.
For kids in this age range, we're talking about it happens several times a week that it's happening. And again,
Mhm.
not necessarily about situations where you can tell, all right, this is a very specific and isolated circumstance, and he's being vindictive about that same
Mhm. Mhm.
over a period of time.
Right.
It's not, again, not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about a recurring pattern, that this is the way that they tend to handle things over and over and over again, for at least, we're talking about like 6 months or more.
Exactly.
The diagnostic criteria, it has to happen over a period of time and frequent enough
Mhm.
to raise that concern.
Yeah. So what the DSM do, what the manuals do, is children younger than 5 have to show this most days for at least 6 months. That's the pattern that we're talking about, that it's over and over and over and over. For children older than 5, it's once a week. So it doesn't occur as often, but it occurs over that 6-month period. So you see that pattern of behavior. It occurs over and over and over again. Okay.
Mhm.
Intensity, and this is interesting. It's easy to follow this. There are 3 levels: mild, moderate, and severe ODD. Mild occurs in 1 setting, typically the home. Moderate is in 2 settings, and severe is in 3 or more settings. So if you have a child who's doing this everywhere, in school, at church, at home, on the baseball field, maybe it's more severe if it's occurring everywhere. Typically, it occurs at home because that's typically where kids learn these behaviors.
Right. And
Generally speaking,
and
okay.
just one more piece with this is that, I know we were focusing on vindictiveness as sort of the most concern, but a kid can be vindictive and present it most days for, years.
Mhm.
But if vindictiveness is the only symptom, then that's still not oppositional defiant disorder. Just to be clear, there are other criteria, because remember, as you mentioned, Richard, a moment ago, there's 2 other categories of angry and irritable, and that argumentative and defiant. There's a
Mhm.
cluster of symptoms that we'd be looking for, and
Right.
that that symptom pattern of all of those different symptoms have to be present for that, most days, or at least once a week for 6 months. So
Right.
it's more than just vindictiveness. It includes all of those things, but vindictiveness is the one that we often worry about the most.
Right. Now, typically we diagnose ODD in early elementary school. It appears around age, typically with the terrible 2s or 3s. And instead of the child settling down, most kids have temper tantrums, but you ignore them and they go away. For these children, the temper tantrums tend to persist. That defiant behavior tends to persist. But it's usually by early elementary school, kindergarten, first, second grade, the diagnosis is made. And over time, it either diminishes or the child goes into a darker corner, and it could transform into something like conduct disorder.
Mhm.
So, with that in mind, what are the treatments? How do we deal with this stuff? And typically, when you have children who are very strong, psychologically strong, who are very persistent, who will chase, we have parents who say, yeah, but if I ignore him, he'll chase me around the house. I have to lock myself in a room because my child is pursuing me, and they keep after me. When you have that kind of intensity, children who are significant behavior problems, there is this tendency to push parents to one of 2 extremes. Some parents just become permissive because they don't want to have those battles. They don't want to keep fighting about this stuff. So one of the extremes is parents become too permissive, and the result, of course, the child gets worse. The other is that parents become coercive. They become authoritarian, and they want to scare the child or punish the child into submission. And that negative interaction, that punitive interaction, can turn the child dark and things will get worse. So remember that there's a dynamic here with kids with oppositional defiant disorder, that the parents are either going to they could become too permissive or too authoritarian. And that then is going to lead to even worse behavior.
Yeah.
So, so there's 2 ways that children and parents can drift toward ODD. One is you're ignored and you start yelling, that you're the parent and you ask the child to do something, the child says no, and you start yelling and screaming. That's going to make it worse. Or you insist and you spark a tantrum, and then you're going to back up, especially if the child becomes aggressive. So we tend to drift toward ODD. And so as we think about the treatment, we have to think about how we got there. So with
Right.
that in mind, what's the treatment?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I like the word that you used, their drift, because we tend to think of things, okay, this is where things are now. And we tend to imagine that things went from 0 to this, like
Mhm.
immediately. And we know that that's not really the way that it happens.
Right.
It does
Right.
start in early childhood during those toddler years, and it just, there's hundreds of thousands of
Mhm.
trials of different things. You're trying different things to get what you want, and the child is doing different things to get what they want. And
Mhm.
those interactions shape the behavior over a period over those years.
That's
And
right.
so it's not we went from nothing to this. Parents will come in sometimes and say, just he was so sweet and so this and so that. And now all of a sudden he's this. Rarely is it that it just comes like that out of nowhere. There's always some indication as you dig a little bit deeper. Well, yeah, he did have a hard time with those kinds of things, and
Mhm.
yeah, this was the way that I responded to that then. And
Mhm.
you can see how those patterns started to form. But it's really, again, it's really difficult. So when you think about what our interventions are, kind of getting back to how do you get them to do homework?
Right.
These interventions will work whether you're concerned about homework, or you're concerned about him doing chores, or you're concerned about
Right.
him going to bed on time.
Mhm.
And the first thing is, just like last week we talked about, you have to work on the relationship.
Right.
It, it- Parents will bring their kids into our office and say, fix him. And you can't do that. That's not the approach that you have to take. You have
Right.
to first fix the relationship, because if you're
Mhm.
not working together, you're working against each other.
Right. And remember we said you drift toward ODD.
Mhm.
There's, a child might be born with a difficult temperament. We understand that. There are kids who have a difficult temperament. They might be highly anxious or angry or some. So there's a little bit of temperament involved. But ODD occurs because you've had this interaction with your child for hundreds or thousands of interactions that lead us to this
Right.
the oppositional behavior. So the first thing is there are some general principles if you're dealing with ODD. One is you got to repair the relationship, because eventually you're going to have to work together. You are not going to defeat a child with ODD.
Right.
You can yell, scream, paddle, spank. You can do whatever you want. You're not going to defeat them.
Because
So
of the nature of ODD,
it's
they wouldn't have that diagnosis if the diagnosis is correct. They wouldn't have that diagnosis if they didn't push back. I mean, they go together. That's what's going to happen.
so by definition,
Yeah.
that's what you're going to be dealing with. So you can't work together if you're adversaries. You're going to eventually have to work this out together.
Mhm.
That there's no other way to do it. You
Right.
cannot punish a child into submission. You can punish them. They'll behave when they're around you, but
Right.
as soon as you're gone, it's going to break loose.
Right.
So you're going to eventually have to work together. So the first thing you do is you have to repair the relationship. You have to be able to work together to solve what is a problem for you and is a problem for your child. You're going
Absolutely.
to have second thing you're going to have to do, you're going to have to find some middle ground between being too permissive and being too authoritarian. There's a place there, the Goldilocks place, that you're going to have to find somewhere between those two extremes. And then the third thing is you have to be consistent. Many parents say, well, I tried that and it didn't work. The programs that you'll be given will work if you do them consistently over a period of time.
Right.
None of these are going to work quickly. It's like a diet. It's like an exercise program. You're not going to go out and run a marathon on day two.
Right.
You have to do these things. You have to do these programs for a while. Eventually they'll work, but you have to be consistent and you have to have the patience to hang in there through the tough times.
Absolutely. Because if you think about what we've just spent a few minutes talking about, you drifted to this place. So that means that you got to where you are now over
Mm,
over a period of years.
right,
Just like you don't go from zero to where you are now overnight, you're not going to go from where you are now to better
right.
overnight. It's going to take some time, and it's going to, your kid is going to anticipate your reactions just as much as you're anticipating their reactions. And so those behavioral patterns have to change over time. And
Mhm.
the when you think about some of the treatments, one area, for example, is just parent training programs, and there's a number of those that can be used. But when you think about parent training programs, the goal is to focus on how the parent and child are interacting and how
Right.
the parent is responding to the behavior of the child. And as I said there very specifically, how the parent is responding to the child. That's not even considering how the child is responding, because as the parent, you have to focus on how you're responding. I go back to what I said a minute ago. Parents will sometimes come in and just say, fix him,
Hmm.
as though the parent can just keep doing what he or she is doing, and the child is going to change
Right.
the way that they're
Mhm.
responding to everything naturally because I tell them to change. That's
Right.
not going to happen. The parent has to change as well. And there's other programs, other portions of the program that we'll mention in a minute where the kid is working on some things, but parents, you have to work on things too. You cannot expect your pre-adolescent, your going through puberty kid to make all of these magnificent changes and say, oh, right, you know what, you're right. I am making things so much more difficult. Why am I doing that? I should have been thinking about this all along. That's not going to happen. But parents, you have
Right.
to make some changes.
Yeah, with difficult children, and we're parents, and we understand that children are different, and some kids are real easy, and some kids are more difficult. And when you get these difficult kids who are nervous or anxious or high strung, or they require a different approach, and so the change has to occur from the parent. That
Right,
it begins with the parent, because what you've done, the interaction that you've had with this difficult child has created this new situation,
right,
and so you're going to have to do something different. You can't have the same relationship with your child and expect change. You keep doing the same thing and you expect a different outcome.
right.
So it's not your fault. It's not that you have to do all the work, or, parents will come in and say, well, I'm not the problem. He's the problem, or she's the problem.
Can I throw in right there that
Yeah.
parents will say that, and then the parent will leave the room and the kid will be in here. And you know what the kid says? I'm not the problem. They're the problem. And so
Exactly.
they both feel like the other person is the problem. And,
Right.
and that obviously is a big problem.
Right.
Because if each person feels like, well, for things to get better, the other person has to change,
Right.
not going to make any changes themselves until that other person makes change. We're stuck. We're not going anywhere.
And I think that's the key to this thing. What you just said is that each one expects the other to
Mhm.
change. If my parents would change, I would do better. And the parent, well, if he would change, I would do. You're absolutely right. They're each holding the other accountable. And that's why they have to work together. There has to be this interaction where both understand and acknowledge that what they're doing isn't working.
Right, right.
They
You
have
know,
to.
there's a number of parent training programs out there. There's parent-child interaction therapy, parent management training programs, there positive parenting programs. There's a lot of different systems out there, and truly, it doesn't necessarily matter which one you use. The goal of all of them is the same, to improve those interactions. And as the parent is working on that, again, perhaps the child could be working on something like, working through something like cognitive behavioral therapy or social skills training, some of those kinds of things to help them understand how their thoughts and feelings influence their behaviors and how those behaviors are affecting other people.
Right.
That combination of things to help the child understand what they need to do to adjust things. And of course, the parent training programs to help the parent understand how they're influencing things.
Right. Parents will frequently say, well, what's the best? Well, which one of these is the best one? There is no best one. Look at them. We list 5 in the show notes. Look at each one, and number one, pick out the one that you like the best, and then do it long enough for it to be effective.
Right.
You can't do it for a week. I mean, how long did it take you to get here? If you have a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, it took you 7 years to get here. You're not going to unravel that in a couple of weeks. So stay with them long enough. We frequently get requests to do CBT. We'll get a question. Would you please do CBT with my child? Maybe, if CBT is the right thing to use, But if it's oppositional defiant disorder, we'll do CBT with the child, but we're also going to do parent training with you. So we can't just fix the child.
Right.
There has to be a change on both. Sometimes we don't want to use social skills programs because these kids tend to have poor social skills. So that's another one. Medication is another issue. There's no medication for ODD. If a child also has ADHD, and there's about a 50 or 60% overlap, you can treat depression or you can treat ADHD if they're comorbid conditions, but there's no medication for oppositional defiant disorder. Mainly, parents have to change and the kid has to change, and they have to work together.
Right. So as we wrap this up, our advice is not too dissimilar from last week, is that we first have to recognize that the problem isn't just homework. The problem is usually much more broad than just homework, and includes a variety of other issues. Rarely is it, yeah, I can't get him to do his homework. He just refuses. But he does chores every day, and he gets up when I ask him to get up, and he stops playing video games when I ask him to stop.
Right.
It's usually all of those things, and so there's almost always other problem areas. So what we really need to do is triage and figure out what do we really need to focus on first, and then approach it from that perspective, and then what's the next thing and what's the next thing, because you have to stop that bleeding. You have to stop all the arguing, stop all the fighting, all that need for control. You have to back away from that so that you can address the most important concerns first.
That's right. Just stop all the fighting and arguing so that you can start to work together. The other thing is you want to get this balance between being too permissive and being too punitive, but also, and please keep this in mind, now that you have a middle schooler, it is time for you to start practicing detachment parenting. You have to back up a little bit. You're not going to have the power and authority that you thought you had when they were younger, especially with these kids. So you're going to have to practice detachment parenting, be consistent, create something new, and begin to use approaches like Ross Green's collaborative problem solving, where you work together with your child to solve these problems together.
Right.
That'll be
and this is, and we're out of time for today, but another issue we have to talk about at some point, perhaps in another podcast, is the issue of as you're doing your detachment parenting and you're backing away and allowing them to experience the full-fledged consequences of not doing their work. What happens when you don't do your homework, and experiencing those grade-related consequences. Recognize that there's going to be some forces that work against you with that, because we have this whole system of grade recovery and all of this other stuff where a kid may go the entire quarter of a school year and not do work, but then can do a Saturday morning work class and do a few packets and end up with a C in the class anyways. So you have to be careful of those things that may be working against you. And again, that's stuff maybe for another topic, for another podcast, but just be mindful of that your job is to start putting some of those, start allowing your preteen to start experiencing those consequences and making some of those decisions for themselves, and then experience those, the outcome of that.
Exactly. Yep.
All right. With that, that is it for today. Definitely write in if you have other questions. I just have a feeling that we're going to get one about what about elementary school kids? We'll see.
We'll be ready. We'll be ready for that.
So, all right. Until then, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.